Thank you. Let me apologize for reading my speech. I just come from Hiroshima and needed to help the translator, so please accept my apologies. And as I begin, let me just say that I was at a meeting of the Nobel Peace Laureates, and their singular demand was for the complete abolition of all nuclear weapons now. I want to thank Rainer Braun and the Planning Committee for the privilege to join you today and to join in the challenge of NATO, its nuclear policies, and the Afghanistan war. I've been asked to speak about NATO's new nuclear doctrine. In sum, as the Guardian in London reported, it is that the so-called new strategic concept will have nuclear weapons remaining at the core of NATO's doctrine, and an attempt to withdraw an estimated 200 American B-61 nuclear bombs from Europe, a legacy of the Cold War, is not to be mentioned in the new doctrine. So much for change that we can believe. Then to my talk. With time limited and the focus on NATO's nuclear doctrines, there's little time to discuss the disastrous recent U.S. election. In short, it resulted from the confluence of corruptions of our political system and our economic crisis. The environment in the United States is reminiscent of the early 1930s, when the Great Depression was fertile ground for the rise of fascism. More optimistic writers are thinking in terms of the United States becoming a banana republic. Because we can't understand NATO's nuclear doctrines, old and new, without understanding how NATO fits into Washington's global strategies, I will begin by talking about U.S. geostrategic thinking, and will then turn to the history, roles, and specifics of U.S. NATO nuclear doctrines. The foundations of U.S. dominance carried with them the seeds of their undoing, and thus to the current crisis. The Albright Report and its recommendations reflect efforts by U.S. militarists and elites to compromise militarily, and to lesser extents economically, for the relative decline in U.S. power and influence that was accelerated by the Bush-Cheney romance of ruthlessness. The Albright Report is a dreamscape envisioned to reinforce U.S., European, and global dominance. Fortunately, Europe, with all the problems it has on its own, is not rushing to embrace the Albright Report. NATO has always been about more than containing Moscow. George Kennan, the author of the Containment Doctrine, wrote that given the Red Army's sacrifices in driving Hitler's armies from Moscow to Berlin, the post-war division of Europe was inevitable, if not just. Eastern Europe would serve as its buffer against future invasions from the West, going back to Napoleon. Like the unequal treaties of European colonialism in Asia, NATO has been a fig leaf, providing a degree of legitimacy for the continuing U.S. military occupation of Europe and the related U.S. political influence across Western Eurasia. The collapse of the Soviet Union eliminated NATO's Cold War raison d'etre and undermined the rationales for the foreign deployment of hundreds of thousands of U.S. warriors, not only in Europe but globally. In response, elite figures led by Zbigniew Brzezinski conceded the imperial nature of the U.S. project. Brzezinski's book, The Grand Chessboard, was a primer, explaining that the empire's most essential geostrategic requirement is dominance of the Eurasian heartland, and that the U.S. must have footholds on Eurasia's western, southern, and eastern peripheries. Witness Obama's recent travels and diplomacy, first to India and Indonesia, then to Korea and Japan, and now to Portugal. Brzezinski explained that first-rank U.S. allies, like most in NATO, are vassal states, that's a quote, whose elites share in the imperial privilege. An example of how this works is NATO's nuclear planning group. Of course, NATO also serves as a rear base to reinforce U.S. dominance of Eurasia's southern flank, the oil-rich Middle East, and it helps to make the Central Asian War possible. This weekend, heads of state will kowtow to an updated version of the Albright Report, with its call to extend the war in Central Asia beyond 2015, its demands for greater alliance solidarity and military spending, and its insistence on keeping U.S. nuclear weapons in Europe. But European leaders will commit to only the minimum needed to maintain the alliance. None of this can reverse the more powerful realpolitik dynamics. Russia's military power continues to decline. As the Albright report concedes, Europe faces no immediate threat of foreign invasion. With the economic crisis, there will be no appetite to implement Washington's demands for greater European military spending. Some NATO forces will continue to fight in Afghanistan while others leave, as the U.S. pursues its doomed strategy of deadly Vietnam-style coercive diplomacy. But the ambition to transform NATO into a global alliance committed to out-of-area operations, in part to contain China, has largely perished in the Afghan quagmire. Unaware of the deadly connection between foreign military interventions and preparations for and threats to initiate nuclear war, most U.S. people think of the U.S. nuclear arsenal only in terms of deterrence, an approach that some in the Pentagon have said, and I quote, has never been our doctrine. A classical example of this misconception is an early history of NATO's nuclear doctrines, published by the Air Force-related RAND Corporation. Written amidst the 1980s debates over deployment of First Strike Pershing II, cruise, and S-20 missiles in Europe, it celebrated the flexible response doctrine formally blessed by NATO in 1967, but which originated with Henry Kissinger's advocacy of fighting and winning, believe it or not, limited nuclear wars. The RAND history stresses NATO's inability to fulfill an agreement made here in Lisbon in 1954 to match conventional Soviet military deployments, as well as the anticipated end of the U.S. nuclear monopoly. In response, we had Eisenhower's massive retaliation doctrine. To deter an anticipated Soviet aggression, NATO's conventional forces were in place to serve as tripwires, containing a possible Soviet attack, until Washington's, and I quote, nuclear sword could strike down the aggressor. This illogic collapsed in 1957 with Moscow's launch of the Sputnik satellite, which intimated that Moscow's ICBMs could soon deter the United States' massive retaliation strikes. It took a decade for the mad policy of mutually assured destruction to prevail. But throughout the 1960s, the U.S. and NATO deployed so-called tactical theater nuclear weapons, many with the destructive capability of the Hiroshima A-bomb, as well as strategic hydrogen nuclear weapons at sea, more powerful than up to 50 times more powerful than the Nagasaki A-bomb. By the mid-1960s, with more than 7,000 States massive retaliation strikes. It took a decade for the mad policy of mutually assured destruction to prevail. But throughout the 1960s, the U.S. and NATO deployed so-called tactical theater nuclear weapons, many with the destructive capability of the Hiroshima A-bomb, as well as strategic hydrogen nuclear weapons at sea, more powerful than up to 50 times more powerful than the Nagasaki A-bomb. By the mid-1960s, with more than 7,000 U.S. nuclear weapons in Europe, Europeans rightly feared that they would suffer the most in a nuclear war. It was widely understood that a so-called limited war could easily escalate to a total nuclear war. And as Daniel Ellsberg learned, the U.S. Single Integrated Operational Plan, which is to say launching all of the missiles, anticipated the deaths of more than 500 million people across Eurasia. This was U.S. and NATO doctrine, the murder of more than 500 million people. Then as now, the challenge for U.S. strategists was to prevent Europe's decoupling from the United States, the Western foothold on Eurasia. To prevent Europe from going its own way, the Nuclear Planning Group was created, as were dual-key launch controls. Throughout this period, the U.S. NATO nuclear arsenal had objectives other than containment. As President Carter's Secretary of War, Harold Brown, testified, with nuclear weapons as the core of U.S. security systems, U.S. conventional forces became, and I quote, meaningful instruments of military and political power. As Noam Chomsky explained, this meant that we have succeeded in sufficiently intimidating anyone who might help protect those we are determined to attack. Thus, as early as 1946, before the Soviet Union broke the U.S. nuclear monopoly, President Truman threatened Moscow with nuclear annihilation in order to reinforce U.S. dominance in Iran. U.S. nuclear weapons in Europe were essential to U.S. preparations for and threats to initiate nuclear war, not only during the Berlin crises of 1948 and 1961, but as the U.S. reinforced its hegemony of the oil-rich Middle East, which was long the geostrategic center of the struggle for world power. As I've outlined in my book, which is outside Empire and the Bomb, such threats were also made during the Suez Crisis in 1956, the incursion into Lebanon and the revolution in Iraq in 1958, the 1962 missile crisis, in which the U.S. threatened all of human existence in order to enforce the principle that the U.S. could deploy nuclear weapons along the Soviet Union's periphery, especially Turkey, but that the Soviet Union could not do likewise. We made these threats and preparations during the Six-Day Middle East War in 1967, the Iraq Wars of 1991 and 2003, and the current all-options